All right, should we start? Are we starting with the live stream? We're on. All right, thanks everyone for waiting. Welcome everyone to FIU and to the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. On behalf of the center and on behalf of Atlas Network, I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the Index of Bureaucracy Latin America 2022. If you would allow me, I'd like to begin with a few thank yous and recognitions. First, Mr. President, thank you for being here. President Duque, it's an honor to have you. Ambassador Dobransky, thank you for being here. We see a lot of really good friends, and a lot are going to continue to come in. Since we are FIU's newest, and I'd like to think most exciting research center, I always begin my remarks at public events with a few words about who we are. We were established, the Adam Smith Center was established by the legislature and the governor of the great state of Florida in 2020 to harness the power of rigorous research and offer a better understanding of the free enterprise system and its impact on individual freedom and human prosperity around the world. I say around the world, even though so far we have had a little bit more emphasis on the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean for obvious reasons. Through our activities and programs, the center hopes to inspire and enlighten policy discussions, analysis, and decision-making. And the way I look at it, we have four major objectives. Number one, to advance research and scholarship through projects like the one we're announcing today. Second, to promote excellence in education and mentorship. And the crown jewel of this pillar of our mission is the Senior Leadership Fellows program. We have two of the Senior Leadership Fellows here with us, President Duque and Ambassador Dobransky, who are concluding their fellowship for the semester. Third, engage in outreach and do public events like this one. And fourth, to improve public policy. We are steadfast in our commitment to promoting ideas and discussions relevant to all sides of the political spectrum, with meaningful representation from academics and practitioners alike. As a university, we strongly believe in the principles of free expression and the respectful exchange of ideas and viewpoints, even those ideas and viewpoints that are difficult to hear at times. But even though we're steadfast in that commitment to impartiality and freedom of expression, we're unabashedly supportive of democracy and the free enterprise system as the most effective ways to promote individual freedom and human prosperity. And that is why we're so excited to be launching this initiative today, the Index of Bureaucracy Latin America. As you're about to learn over the next few minutes, this index highlights one of the greatest obstacles to achieving prosperity and economic freedom in the entrepreneurial structure of any nation: hyper-regulation, the vast number of controls and procedures that limit productive activities, commerce, and innovation, and slows down economic growth, both for individuals and for society at large. This research initiative, which is now a joint partnership between the Adam Smith Center and Atlas Network, emphasizes the bureaucratic burdens that small enterprises must confront, not only for their creation, but also for their daily activities. The study that we're about to unveil looks at 11 countries, which combined make up almost 90% of the population in Latin America. Now, I'm not one of these people who believes that we should have no bureaucrats and bureaucracy is all bad. No, an effective bureaucracy is necessary for the functioning of any modern society. However, when that bureaucracy becomes excessive, out of hand, it inhibits the flourishing of commercial activity, discourages investment and creative efforts, and take up material and human resources that would otherwise be allocated to production and innovation. It also forces millions of entrepreneurs into informality, leading them to work outside the legal framework and consequently beyond the radar of legitimate government oversight and the tools necessary for the implementation of sound public policies. While the index highlights the regulatory and bureaucratic areas that are not working in the region, in other words, the problems, one of the things I like about this index is that it looks at some case studies that showcase successful policies that remove barriers to productive commercial activity and allow citizens to prosper. In other words, the study helps us understand what needs to be done and what needs to be avoided to achieve better results. At the same time, it helps us understand how differences in institutional and policy frameworks across different countries in the region can help or hinder the dynamics of virtuous cycles that promote economic freedom, that promote progress, and that promote prosperity. I'm going to make now an introduction, but before that, I'd like to express our deep gratitude to Atlas Network, to Brad Lips, the CEO, who could not be here with us today, but he's very well represented, as you're about to learn. Roberto Salinas, thank you, the Executive Director of the Center for Latin America at Atlas Network, for inviting us to be part of this enterprise, which is very, very exciting for us. I am truly convinced that this index will continue to grow, both in reach and in impact, and that it will become a key reference for those interested in the design and implementation of public policies that lead to a society that is more free, more fair, and more prosperous for all. I'm also convinced, I'm personally convinced, that it will become a useful instrument to help advance one of the key motivators for our center, that is the relationship between thinking and doing, to create meaningful transformations with positive social impact. The identification of barriers and obstacles to commercial activities is valuable insofar as decision makers, policymakers, can use them to promote policies that lead to greater economic activity and allow millions and millions of small and micro enterprises and entrepreneurs to generate prosperity for their families, for their communities, and for their countries. That is why we're interested in looking for better incentives that lead to better results. Now, it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you the COO of Atlas Network, Lyle Swim. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for joining us today. It is a privilege to be here. Pinch hitting for Brad, who wishes he could be here, but you get me instead. I'd like to take a moment and express a heartfelt thank you to the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom and all the staff, particularly Atilda Alvarido, who has helped coordinate this event and make it such a great success. I'd like to extend an additional thank you to Carlos, who is the founder and director of the center, who has really caught the vision of this project and has become a critical partner for this year's program. As for the index itself, a project of this caliber would not be possible without the strong leadership, excellent coordination, and rigorous academic guidance provided by Sadi Levy-Carciente, a senior fellow of Cedice Libertad, and you will get to hear from Sadi shortly. It is important to note that a project like this is not a one-man show, or in our case, a one-woman show. In addition to Sadi's efforts, I would like to thank the 11 Atlas Network partners who have participated. Several of those groups have representatives here today, and they will also be sharing a few remarks later. Those partners include Fundación Libertad, Instituto Liberal, Instituto de Ciencia Política Hernán Echevarría Alazaga, Ideas Labs, Instituto Libertad y Desarrollo, Instituto Ecuatoriano de Economía Política, México Evalúa, Asociación de Contribuyentes del Perú, Instituto OMG, Centro de Estudios para el Desarrollo, and Cedice Libertad. I'd like to say a few thanks to some key Atlas Network staff who have been instrumental in this effort as well. First and foremost, Roberto Salinas Leon, our director for the Center of Latin America. This index is very much him and his passion for eliminating what he often refers to, and I hear him talk about, the economics of extortion. He's provided important leadership in incubating and scaling this project. Secondly, to my colleague, Hani Crevallari, who's not here today, but has been extremely important in ensuring that all the behind-the-scenes details get done so that this project could reach the finish line. Thirdly, a group thank you to our marketing, design, and translation teams for their tireless efforts to produce an amazing report that many of you have picked up and is available out at the desk outside. And then Hunter Rausch, my colleague as well, who is providing on-the-ground support for this event. Lastly, we could not do what we do at Atlas Network without the generous contribution of hundreds of donors who give of their resources so that we can do this critical work. And as such, I'd like to specifically thank the Drake Foundation for their support for this index. Thank you all. Before I share a few remarks about the index itself, I'd like to use the podium, as Carlos did, and share a little bit about Atlas Network, for those of you who may not be familiar. Atlas Network provides a range of support to more than 530 think tanks around the world as they work to drive change in the climate of ideas, culture, and policy. In so doing, they remove barriers to opportunity and empower individuals to live a life of choice. At Atlas, we are guided by our belief that solutions to local problems are not universal. We believe in locally grown solutions to localized issues. In other words, what works in one place may not work in another one. Changes that have real lasting power and cultural buy-in always come from the bottom up. It's this belief combined with our effort to grow and strengthen the network in Latin America that we launched the Center for Latin America in 2018 with the aim of working with a growing number of local civil society organizations across the region to solve complex issues from the bottom up. Now, why the Index of Bureaucracy? Why this particular project? The last 2 years have been challenging, to say the least. The Latin American region, like the rest of the world, has wrestled with a global pandemic, which has created massive economic and social headwinds. Democratic norms have been challenged and undermined by authoritarian regimes and anti-liberal movements. And war and geopolitical conflicts around the globe continue to threaten further political and economic instability. The tendency in these times of crisis is for people to cry out for their respective governments to do something. The question then becomes, well, do what? What should governments do? Sadly, history shows us that the typical response by governments is to get bigger. Solutions often come in the shape of large relief packages, new regulations, new agencies that are crafted often with benign intentions, but more often than not fail to help those that need the relief and create an ever-bloated regulatory state that becomes increasingly predatory and robs everyday men and women of their dignity and hope for a better future. Governments and public officials across Latin America are no exception here when it comes to this tendency to grow the regulatory state. The growth has become so problematic that the term red tape perhaps no longer adequately describes the impact of this growth of bureaucratic interventionism. Latin America has moved from a red tape to a black tape, I'm borrowing from Saudi when I use that term, state where indignities, high opportunity costs, and mounting hurdles are crushing everyday Latin Americans. But where the biggest problems exist, so too exist the biggest opportunities for change. The Index of Bureaucracy in Latin America offers an alternative way for governments and public officials to do something. The index provides a clear-eyed, data-driven picture of the dehumanizing bureaucratic maze, which often includes permits, concessions, licenses, rules and regulations, and burdensome taxes, to name a few, that make life for everyday Latin Americans more difficult as they just try to make an honest living. Unlike most of the other research tools that you may see around, put together by the development community, this index does not rely on attracting foreign investment. Instead, this index starts with the assumption that everyday men and women from Bolivia to Brazil, from Honduras to Haiti, and from Panama to Peru have the capacity to be drivers of value creation and innovation. Given the current climate I described earlier, the launch of this second Index of Bureaucracy provides a generational opportunity and moment for governments and public officials across Latin America. It is an opportunity to lead differently. While other countries around the world continue to follow the well-worn path during times of crisis, enlarging the administrative state, government officials in Latin America can chart a new and different course. They can take a less traveled path. In thinking about this moment in time that this launch represents for Latin America, I'm reminded of a favorite poem of my father, Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. I'm going to adjust it slightly given our circumstances and just quote the final paragraph. We shall be telling this, the story of the launch of the Index of Bureaucracy in 22 and its subsequent reforms, with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and we, the Latin Americans, we took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Here's to that difference, and to Latin America leading the way to a more free, a more open, a more peaceful, and a more prosperous future for us all. The world is watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyle, for those inspiring remarks. My name is Roberto Salinas. I'm the director of the Center for Latin America at Atlas Network, and I'm truly delighted to be able to be participating in the launch of the Index of Bureaucracy 2022 in strategic partnership with the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. Is something that was actually, I can share with you the story. Carlos and I had the opportunity to share a few thoughts at our Latin America Liberty Forum, at our Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner in 2021, which was held here in Miami. And one thing led to another, and why don't we do things together, and why don't we collaborate? And in that same spirit that the Adam Smith Center was founded, to engage and exchange ideas about how to better promote freedom, about this magnificent lemma about thinking, doing, and acting that we think is vitally important at Atlas. Well, here's the first of, I hope, many efforts that can be done in joint partnership between the Adam Smith Center and Atlas Network. So indeed, we have worked hard throughout the year to be able to compile this index. It's, as our next speaker will be telling you, Sari Levy, it's a small universe of countries. It's only 11. We need to expand it. Those are the plans for the future. But we think it's an extremely important metric that cuts across the highly polarized and highly confrontational public and political discourse that we see today throughout the world, but particularly in Latin America. Whether it's us versus them, it's left versus right, there's always an ideological battle. This is why our hashtag, our lemma, our motto has been "Déjame trabajar." That's it. There's nothing ideological about that. It's common sense. It's simply getting ahead. And many countries are beginning to recognize that. We see that in certain efforts in Latin America. Uruguay, certainly with Luis Lacalle Pou. In Ecuador, there's a great deal of struggle, but President Lasso is trying to do his effort there. As you will see in our presentation, Brazil is a special case study for bureaucracy on small and medium-sized concerns. Today it was announced. Today there was news in the Economist that Spain is now beginning. The entire country is beginning to take the example of the great Isabel Díaz Ayuso, who has turned Madrid into one of the great investment capitals of the world. Why? Because they do realize that it's important to dejar trabajar and to let people work. And that focus seemed to be acknowledged by The Economist magazine itself last year when they wrote a great editorial called Beware of the Bossy State. 1 week after we launched the Index 2021. I'm not saying that one had to do with the other, but I like to think that we're thinking along the same lines and that it has really nothing to do with taking an ideological position, but rather about the policy reforms and the acting that needs to be done. And this is why the collaboration, not just between Atlas and the Adam Smith Center, but also with all the partners that have worked so hard throughout the year. They're a good example of what Samuel Gregg, in a magnificent editorial on the rebirth of political economy and the need to focus on what Friedrich Hayek said. He or she who knows economics knows very little, only knows economics, knows very little economics. The idea being that economics really is much more than economics. It's also politics, it's also rule of law, it's also the moral foundations of a free society. And we think all of this is captured in the index, particularly in the idea of déjame trabajar and of the policy recommendations that each country needs to do in order to be able to secure a freer, more prosperous society that is particularly mindful of the need for inclusive prosperity in our countries. So without further ado, I would like to present my dear friend, the president of the Academia Nacional de Ciencias Económicas in Venezuela, a highly respected political economist, a great economist in her own right, Dr. Sari Levy Careciente. It's a great honor for you to be our general coordinator of the Index of Bureaucracy in Latin America. She will also be representing Se Dice Libertad on this occasion as she is a senior fellow. Sari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, for this introduction and all of you. And allow me to begin these words expressing my satisfaction for being here today, sharing with such a prestigious audience the result of the Index of Bureaucracy in its second edition. And of course, thanking Atlas Network, its Center for Latin America, and also Adam Smith Center of FIU. So please thank to all of them for your support with this project, with this, our project. So there are, let's say, just a few things all around the world that achieve such a consensus, like the disgust and rejection professed to the burden bureaucracy had become. So here in this study, we will offer not only the description of the present situation in 11 countries of Latin America, but also the necessary information to deal with this problem. Let's begin explaining the reasons that motivated us with the project. First of all, in Latin America, micro, small, and medium-sized companies practically represent the entire business universe. They account for 60% of the formal employment. However, they contribute only with 25% of GDP. We are talking of a very, very low productivity. And although business success is closely linked to the development of the internal business strengths, there are external factors that can cripple their ability to be competitive. Here, it's important the role of the state, the economic institution, public policies, which can favor or hinder business efficiency. They can become an onerous burden measured in time and money, even more so for small companies with very limited resources in time when we speak about finance resources or human resources. Moreover, the imposition of disproportionate bureaucracy, in addition to preventing long-term value generation, condemns companies to the informal sector and also create perverse incentives for corruption, weakening trust, and also social cohesion. So having as a goal to promote a dynamic and sustainable development measured, let's say, in a multidimensional and also intergenerationally, a competitive institutional environment is always a must. So with that in mind, the goals of our project were to offering a metric to be tracked and compared in time and space of the bureaucratic burden for Latin American companies has to comply with. This will help us to build a critical analysis on this issue based on data and not on opinions. And that is the best way to support the principle of subsidiarity of the state, to achieve the development of a free, responsible, and prosperous society for the Latin American region. And this year, we included, as we already have known, 11 countries in our index. And we raised the information thanks to our partners in each of those countries. We are talking about Fundación Libertad in Argentina, Instituto Liberal in Brazil, Instituto de Ciencia Política en Colombia, Ideas Lab in Costa Rica, Libertad y Desarrollo en Chile, Instituto Ecuatoriano de Perú, México Evalúa de México, Asociación de Contribuyentes del Perú, el Instituto OMG de Dominican Republic, Centro de Economía y Desarrollo Uruguay, and Se Dice Libertad in Venezuela. Sorry, I mixed up and began to speak in Spanish. I'm sorry. And well, so let's go to the particular features of our index. First, we pay attention to the productive structure of each country. We did not want to impose a company type. We wanted to work with the most representative kind of company in each country. Also, we have a small business orientation. Why? Because small companies have become in the economic support of most of our family. So it's the source of their well-being. And so if we didn't want to focus on those procedures just to open a company, but those that are needed to make the company continually run. I mean, we wanted all those recurrent procedures to keep the company running. And finally, the metric is shown in hours per year, because we will be speaking in terms of absolute hours with no regards of the opportunity cost in each country. Having this in mind, we organized the project in different stages. First, defining the representative productive activity of the small company in each of the economic sector, primary, secondary, and tertiary, following the relevance and GDP. Second, identifying the operating procedure for that productive activity in each of the economic sectors. Third, we proceed with interviews validating directly with small businessmen and experts. And finally, we run the calculations and advance the analysis of the results. For the purpose of this study, a bureaucratic burden is regarded as imposed by a public authority, and it is unnecessary in complying with market requirements, or it would be much lighter if it weren't for the imposed regulation. This is the basic definition of what we call a bureaucratic burden. And the index, following that, is structured in three groups of, let's say, three kinds of bureaucratic procedures. Those related to the administration of employment, including management of salaries and those associated taxes and contribution, the administration of hiring and firing workers, and all those mandatory labor reports. The second group is those related with administration of operation, and they include tax administration, waste management, vehicle management, and all the mandatory certification and external services to be contracted to comply with the procedures. Finally, a third group we call others, including those specific to the productive activity we are dealing with, all the inspection, monitoring, and special authorization, and all the time the company needs to learn each time we have a change in laws, a change in regulation, change in forms, or change in requirements for, to comply with the bureaucratic procedures. So the three groups of procedures, bureaucratic procedures, has the same weight in the index. So let's go now to deep in the general findings of the project. The first one that I want to speak about is the average number of hours per year spent by small business to comply with bureaucratic procedure, which is in our sample of 548 hours a year. But the figures sometimes tell us many or tell us nothing. How much is 548 hours? Well, the OCDE states that we work between 13 and 2,200 hours per year. So we are talking that in average, 30% of a worker time is devoted only to comply with bureaucratic procedures. 30% of a worker time. The other result that we are finding, and you can see in the graph, is the high dispersion of the results, from 180 hours in Brazil to 1,062 in Venezuela. The difference is 6 times, and it is even higher if you go deeper into the details. For Brazil, it's around 10% of the time of a worker time. However, for Venezuela, it's around 60% of a worker time just for bureaucracy. So also we can see here some countries whose different kind of procedures demand similar time, while in others they are highly different. So the average is just a first approach to the problem we are dealing with. We need to go deeper. And for that, we perform a cluster analysis, including the different results for each kind of procedure. This methodology, the cluster analysis, is a methodology that allows us to gather similar entities into groups while separating those that are more dissimilar. And when we run this cluster analysis, 4 groups emerge. For those interested in detailing the methodology of this cluster analysis, I want just to say, of course, you can go deeper in the report. We use WAR method. However, we also find atypical cases, so indicative of a positive asymmetry. So that means we use Taki transformation ladder too. Details, as I said, in the report, but just those tips in case somebody is interested in the audience. Okay, so let's see, for example, what we found. We found 4 groups. First group include Chile and Ecuador. What's the common in those countries? Both show below the average in bureaucracy of administration, of employment, and operation. In the second group, we find Peru and Dominican Republic. This group show values below the average in administration of employment, however, above the average in administration of operations. Third group, which includes most of the countries, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Uruguay, this group shows values below the average in operations and others, however, above the average in administration of employment. And the last group, Argentina and Venezuela, show values above the average in both of the main group of procedure, employment and administration of operation. So what we are looking at here is that it's not only the figure of the average. It's not that you are in the same group because you have a very similar amount as an average. It depends also how it is composed. So let's go a little deep in this kind of result by type of procedure. And we find that the bureaucracy associated with administration of employment demands almost 55% of the average time. We're talking about near 300 hours a year. It's not only the most consuming procedure in time, but also shows the highest dispersion in all of them, from 85 to 740 in other countries. So when we see these high dispersion, sometimes we get lost because we say, what we can do? What is the common issue? But also dispersion, what it's telling us is there is a huge room to improvement. There is a huge learning opportunity of those cases that are doing much better than when we are. And also, if you look at the result by type of procedures, and you want to compare absolute in relative terms, you also find some interesting issues. In the graph, you can see the relative for the relative in relative term for each country, but in absolute terms, we found that Peru is the country that requires the least number of hours to complete these procedures, 23 hours, followed by Ecuador with 39 and Dominican Republic with 69 hours per year. Meanwhile, Argentina is the country demanding the highest number of hours, followed by Mexico and Colombia. In the case of administration of operation, the procedures related to the declaration and payment of taxes are the ones that consume most of the time. And in the case of the others group of procedure, the most consuming time is based on change of regulations, change on forms. All those changes demand a huge time and learning curve for companies. Also, we ran this test not only by type of procedure, but what happened in each economic sector, primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. And here again, we see a huge dispersion of results. Countries which in every sector, more or less all of them, demand the same amount of time, but countries in which, for example, you can see Chile, in which the secondary sector demands a huge amount of time compared to the secondary, of the primary or tertiary sector. Actually, in the case of Chile, is based, that happens because in the secondary sector, there is construction activity, and that's the one that demands the most time. We also ran a cluster analysis based on economic sector. However, I will not show you all those figures and all those graphs. You can read them carefully and slowly in the report. But what I wanted to tell you is that those clusters were not of 4 members. We didn't need 4 clusters, but only 3. And the members of them in each of the economic sector vary a lot. So what we are saying is that in all cases, efforts to make progress in reducing the bureaucratic burden must consider the specificities of each sector, of each type of procedure, and each economic sector, and even the particularities of certain productive activities. Well, let me jump a little in the conclusion and synthesize what I've been saying. First of all, we've been talking about 548 hours a year as an average of these 11 countries, which represent 30% of a worker times only devoted to bureaucratic procedures. Second, the results show a very high dispersion. And of course, as I've said before, in the average, countries have a difference of 6 times, but if you go to see particular procedures in different kinds, you can find differences of 15 times. So huge room to improve, learning just from what some friends, some neighbors of us are doing. And third, considering the economic sector, the primary sector is the most demanding. However, the secondary sector is the one with the highest dispersion in the sample. We used to speak of Latin America as a generic. We say Latin American countries. However, I want to insist that Latin America is highly heterogeneous, and only a reliable and detailed database of the mandatory bureaucratic procedures could be used as a robust foundation to achieve a tailor-made roadmap to effectively attend these problems, this torment of bureaucracy in each of our countries. And this table that you don't read very clearly is the real hidden treasure of our report. That's the hidden treasure. Actually, you have to go to the appendix, to the annex of the report, to get to the treasury, to the hidden treasury. There is the information. There you can see all of the procedures that a company has to comply. To which entity, which public entity is asking them? If it is, how frequently do you have to comply with it? Each month, each week, each 3 months, once a year? Is it digitized? Is it not? And of course, the time it consumes. So here you can see the bottlenecks. Here you can check where to begin to attack the problem. So, as always, hidden treasures are hidden. So let me tell you a secret. Go to the appendix to get to our hidden treasure. And finally, just as final thoughts, let me insist that to the extent that procedures become more numerous, frequent, and changing, companies tend to rely on specialized agents, and in many cases, informal and even non-legal channels emerge, feeding perverse incentive of corruption networks, weaken the confidence in the rule of law and social cohesion. And we cannot accept that to happen in our countries. The information offered by our index is a relevant source for public policy makers to identify critical bureaucratic nodes and advance transformation. It's crucial to identify those undue, unnecessary, and intrusive demands that only favor excessive control over the citizen. It's not only to make more easy the procedures we have also to eliminate those that are not necessary. And I want to insist this because it's not only to make easy a bad procedure, it's eliminating those that are not necessary, and those who are really necessary, make them effective and easy to be done by companies. And finally, business competitiveness, wealth creation, and social prosperity are only possible in free environments. So we are very, very happy to be here in the Adam Smith Center, a center for freedom, speaking about this issue. Thank you very much. I'm not moving yet because I want to give the floors now one by one to some of the centers that really I had the privilege to lead during this year. Actually, those 11 centers, each of one country, of our 11 countries of the sample, belong to centers of the Atlas Network, and each of them was really the ones who raised the information in each of their country. This result of the report is thanks to them, and I'm very happy to invite it that in a period of a couple of minutes will share with us their main findings. We'll begin in this moment with Brazil, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Paulo Macedo, a board member of the Instituto Liberal in Brazil and professor of international law at the Rio de Janeiro University. In the Doing Business report in 2020, Brazil remained in the last position worldwide, with the highest average in time required to comply with tax obligations, This average, which amounted to 1,500 hours a year, was equivalent to 6 times the world average or 5 times the Latin America average. However, there's a big difference between small companies and the rest of the business universe, given the debureaucratization measures implemented in recent years in an effort to simplify and facilitate starting and doing business in Brazil. The result of such effort is that Brazilian small companies currently require much less time to satisfy their bureaucratic requirements, about 153 hours a year now. What happened? To begin with, the debureaucratization law eliminated the requirement for certain documents and obligations, simplifying unnecessary or overlapping procedures and requirements. The economic freedom law has significantly reduced the time to open and close a business in Brazil, granting a license exemption for low-risk activities that mainly benefit small businesses. The measure allows companies and ventures to develop business considered low risk without the need for state permits or license, guaranteeing the reduction of bureaucracy. The initiative is based on guidelines adopted and developed by the OECD member countries. So, in the last 4 years, Brazil has taken important steps and continues to adopt various strategies to reduce bureaucracy and the loss of time in complying with tax obligations. The labor reform, the economic freedom law, and the digital certification infrastructure have streamlined and integrated processes from the generation of permits for the opening and operation of companies to bankruptcy processes. The average of 180 hours per year for small companies to meet all their obligations is much less than in the past and significantly less than the time spent by medium and large companies on the same trades. In addition, we have revoked almost 5,000 regulatory laws. Still, tax rates are quite high. 15 years ago, a research conducted by the Le Monde Diplomatique, which is a prestigious, albeit left-wing newspaper, a research that resounded heavily in Brazil, concluded that Brazilian overall tax rates were the highest on the planet, with 46% to individuals and almost 40% to corporate companies and business. I believe since then, other countries have surpassed us, but no tax decrease has happened yet. And now, since the Labour Party has won last presidential elections, such improvements are at risk. Free market supporters are yet to formulate an opposition game plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo, from Instituto Liberal. And now, let me invite from Chile, Instituto Libertad y Desarrollo, and that will come with us, Soledad Monge.
Good afternoon. I am Soledad Monge from Libertad y Desarrollo, Chile. In recent years, Chile has automated several procedures required by the government for companies' process. This has facilitated and reduced the time that companies spend in bureaucracy. For example, in the past, the process of stamping receipts and invoice was complex. First, you had to send receipts and invoice to be printed, which could take several days. Then they had to be physically stamped at the Internal Revenue Service. On some occasion, officials would not stamp them at the moment, so you had to pick them up another day. The digitalization of document stamping considerably reduced time and personnel required to carry out this process. Signs printing, folios, and stamping were no longer a concern and could easily be done by application of the Internal Revenue Service, which contains all the necessary information. Regardless, there are still companies that continue to carry out these procedures in person. This occurs especially in regions where companies are less informed, so it is important to provide them with the tools so that they can adapt to this change and therefore reduce the time they spend on bureaucracy procedures. We can observe that the secondary sector dedicates the most time to bureaucracy, approximately 5 times more than the other sectors. In fact, if we do not count these types of demands, the number of hours dedicated to bureaucracy in small companies reduced by more than a half. Especially construction is the activity with the highest load. To carry out their work, small companies must request permits for road occupation, pavement ruptures, excavations, among others, which could take up to 3 months to be approved by the work department of the respective municipality. In this regard, we have also witnessed how these works cannot be carried out or are delayed due to the bureaucracy. Still, the bureaucracy index confirms other measurements, OECD and paying taxes, for example, which shows that administrative procedures are taking away dynamism from our economy. This measurement leaves us in an unfavorable position in the Latin America context, which is serious because it discourages investment and job creation. Consequently, it is essential to modernize the state, to eliminate unnecessary procedures, continue to advance in digitalization and modernize regulation in order to promote development. Thank you very much, and sorry for my English.
Let me invite from Colombia, Instituto de Ciencia Política Hernán Echevarría Olózago, to María Fernanda Gallego.
Good afternoon. My name is María Gallego from the Instituto of Ciencia Política. For the ICP, presenting these results in this current context before you and soon to our decision makers is something fundamental. Colombia is a country of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and we must strive to generate an environment that allows them to increase their productivity, their competitiveness, and with the ultimate goal of generating inclusive prosperity and progress for our society. We are offering the public policy makers and society a valuable tool because they can identify the bottlenecks, and success cases in order to devise strategies that seek to generate business-friendly environment for our enterprises. On average, it takes to a Colombian small enterprise 477 hours a year to comply with the procedures. This means that from 246 working days, labor days, 60 days must be devoted to comply with the corresponding formalities. Labor and tax regulations are those that most affect the small Colombian entrepreneurs. Both obligations imply high cost in time and economic resources, generating disincentives to entrepreneurship and the business function, encouraging informality, evasion, and also an extortion economy. The inflexibility of the labor regulation, that it seems to be the main problem, has an impact on employment generation and leads to informality. This reality imposes the challenge of facing the need of urgent reforms in order to generate an institutional and regulatory environment that adapts to the labor and territorial realities, particularly in terms of productivity and the cost of living. The information in this index will allow us to offer to our current decision makers relevant points for reconsideration of some government proposals, such as the elimination of the service contracting, changes in the working days, increasing the minimum wage, among other initiatives. The reform of labor issues should begin by allowing contribution to Social Security for hourly jobs in order to expand health and pension coverage for independent informal workers. Redefine the mechanism for agreeing on the setting of minimum wage to guarantee the true minimum wage for all workers and improve the quality of the labor markets. Another of the most urgent needs is to provide the rural sector with their own labor regime, recognizing the asymmetries between the rural and the urban activities, promoting the formalization and through the simplification of fiscal taxes and taking into account the productive dynamics of the sector according to the seasonality. The second bottleneck in terms of taxes necessarily implies a redefinition of our tax system and a revelation of the consequences of the negative and externalities it may have. The tax burden is an obstacle to formalization, competitiveness, and employment. More than 90 hours of payments and other 35 hours making tax reports characterize a highly burdensome system for entrepreneurs. This data must be accompanied by the rates because in addition to imposing very high costs of times, it also done in economic matters. Colombia has made progress. It has promoted anti-bureaucratic laws and simplification of some processes, but we must make regulation more flexible and smarter so that it understands the different realities as well as promote a series of structural reforms to boost economic development and continue on the path of economic recovery. Thank you very much.
Let me invite now from Costa Rica, Ideas Lab, to our dear friend, Esther Méndez.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here to share with you the results of this index. I think, this is a pretty nice picture of Costa Rica and the comparison among the countries leave us a pretty nice place. Second, just behind Brazil. But the reality is that in Costa Rica, 50%, the informal sectors accounts for the 50% of the economy. So this shows a pretty nice picture, as I said, but in reality, Costa Ricans, entrepreneurs and small business owners, they don't comply so much with the bureaucratic procedures that are in place. But I would like to say that today is also a very important day in Costa Rica because today we celebrate the Army Abolition Day. Today we celebrate 74th anniversary of the abolition of the army. This was a very brave decision. It was a political relevant decision, and it was something that shaped Costa Ricans and the Costa Rica that we know today, and also it was a decision that led us to invest more heavily in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Now, today, we have other problems, and this index will help us to take this picture to our policymakers and tell them that where they should prioritize in eliminating all this bureaucratic paperwork that keep us from being a developed country. And if we did abolish the army one day, we could also make all these regulatory reforms, and Costa Rica can and will, I know that it will because we can do it, develop our full potential. Thank you.
Let me invite now to Mónica Melo from OMG, Dominican Republic. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mónica Melo, it's Instituto OMG. Well, I'll begin my brief presentation by answering the essential questions for any research of this nature. Why the index is important for the Dominican Republic? Well, the relevance of this index lies in the fact that as a developing country, we generally focus and strive to establish expeditious processes for new investments and new companies, the opening of new businesses. However, the tradition is that we pay less attention to the maintenance and development mechanisms for those already opened business. The data collected in this report, as Sari shows below, allows us to propose interesting and, most important, pertinent regulatory improvements for the development of businesses established in our country. The most important findings in our part of the report was the following. Well, generally, we understand that the permits and license management processes are the ones that generate the greatest time burden for small businesses. However, the interviews showed the proper management and mastery of those special procedures and permits for the sectors where they operate. I'll puntualize that after, because I know that you're looking the numbers. It doesn't seem quite that, but it will. On the other hand, for the businesses interviewed, the major problem is the procedures corresponding to the preparation of documents and reports for tax payment procedures. Although they report that once the preparation for payments is complete, the payment itself is easy and quick to execute. It only takes minutes to pay the taxes. Generally speaking, the interviewees express having a great daily, weekly, and monthly management of a number of fiscal receipts, invoices, a very load in the compilation and preparation of those registrations, also on all the operations they carry out, the incomes, expenses, the maintenance of physical custody of the tax receipts, of all the activities they carry out. And for the small businesses, that is a very big load. Regarding specific permits, the study reflects a higher hourly load in the construction sector. But this load varies from company to company and from year to year, since permits are required for each construction project, not for the company itself. In this sense, in the event that the company carries out a single big one project in a year, its hours in the process showed in the index are obviously less than the company that carries out in the same year 10 projects. And that difference makes an impact in the result on this project that we carry out. But each case, the construction companies that we interviewed demonstrated that they had control of the processes and did not generate any concern that deserves to be highlighted. And that's very weird, because we are talking about a lot of documents and they feel comfortable with that. And also they explained that it doesn't matter if the project is big or small. It will carry the same amount of hours. The thing is that if you have only one in a year, that will impact here in the index in comparison with a company that have 10 projects, for instance. Finally, regarding the management of employee payroll, mainly salary payment, tax withholding, payment of Social Security contributions, the business interviewed indicated that the process is very simple, fast, and is done digitally for employees with bank accounts. This is not the case for the unbanked employees, as happens in many small companies dedicated to agriculture in our country. In those cases, the time invested in management payroll is greatly multiplied, and that difference impacts also the number presented in this index. With this scenario, which improvement actions to be proposed in the short term? Well, we consider it is pertinent to expedite, one, the implementation of the electronic billing invoicing system that I explained in the report is a project that is being carried out as we speak by the tax authorities in the Dominican Republic, and that such mechanisms can be used for all types of companies, not only for the big ones. Number two, the implementation of the programs and projects proposed by the Zero Bureaucracy Program. That is also a current project that is being executed right now by the government. The National Competitiveness Strategy, and also the Digital Agenda. And that in the terms of Digital Agenda, such implementation lead to the necessary regulatory, but most important, structural adjustment to establish the implementation of a unique digital file for business and persons, the implementation of digital identity for citizens and residents, a single institutional technological platform for the procedures of all citizen and business that we have to carry out, and the continue with the implementation of digital onboarding in the financial institutions in order to achieve a more financial inclusion and have the resolve the problem that we've seen before with the agricultural sector. Thank you very much for your time. Let me invite from Ecuador, Instituto Ecuatoriano de Economía Política, to Danilo Vélez.
Good afternoon. My name is Danilo Vélez. I work at the Instituto Ecuatoriano de Economía Política. Historically, Ecuador has failed in benchmark reports regarding business regulation. If there were a World Cup of business regulation, we will be always out in the qualification stages. However, in recent years, there have been efforts by government authorities to improve this situation to ease the environment for enterprises. For instance, in 2018, the Organic Law for the Optimization and Efficiency of Administrative Procedures was issued, and it made a huge improvement in terms of digitalization. That said, as the index reflects, there is still plenty of room for improvement. For instance, business in Ecuador must comply with at least 15 different tax procedures related to the payment of taxes. And that number can even go high up for certain enterprises. Also, there are several activity-specific procedures that represent a huge burden for some industries. In consequence, our recommendations will be, first, a significant simplification of the tax system, and second, to ease the activity-specific procedures by, first, eliminating, in cases that are not necessary, the requirement of submitting physical documents, and also by avoiding the duplication of requirement by establishing a cross-checking mechanism between different government facilities. Thank you.
Let me invite from Mexico Evalúa, to Ana Lilia Moreno.
Thank you, Sari. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. We are delighted to be here. In Mexico, we have been advancing for many years in the digitalization of public services. However, in the last 2 years, we face a very worrisome setback in the advancements. The Mexican small businesses take approximately 500 hours a year to comply with regulations. One bottleneck that is very important for these companies is the labor and social security procedures. This is the higher burden that our companies face. In relation to taxes, during the last 15 years, we had important advances in digitalization. However, these efforts need maintenance. And if the government does not invest in updating the systems, then we can face a setback. And this is what we are looking when we compare the calculations that we made and the interviews that we performed to entrepreneurs from 2021 to 22. The government sometimes observes that the digitalization provides incentives for diminishing corruption. So when a government is worried about the direct relationship with the taxpayer, sometimes the digitalization sets back and the companies need to go back again to the on-site procedure. And that is something that is happening in Mexico. The accountants that we interviewed from one year to the other commented us that the austerity programs implemented in Mexico in all the governmental offices have lost capacities. And that is why in relation to the labor and the tax regulations, our companies are very worried about it. Also, in relation to specific procedures to regulatory compliance, for example, in international trade, in energy sector, advertising sector, the companies also mentioned that the losses in capacity are increasing their operational costs. Why? Because they need to hire in consultants or intermediate specialists who in the past were hired by the government. They were public officials, but due to the austerity programs, they were released, and so they are giving their professional services to the companies, but at higher costs. So this is incrementing the burden and the regulatory obligations of the companies. So these are not very good news, right? What we found in this analysis was the problematic incentive system that our regulatory system has on small companies. And this is, in very simple words, our incentives are not correct. Why? We tested it after the pandemic. According to official statistics, we noticed that our companies, our formal companies, died more rapidly than the informal ones. In Mexico, we have 6 of 10 companies are informal, but 68% of informal companies survived to the pandemic, and 60% of formal companies survived. So we have a rapid resilience of the informal sector, and it's higher than the formal sector. Some of our preoccupations about it is the competitive or antitrust policy is very weak. The companies face monopolistic practices in local economies. Our interviews to agriculture and local people dedicated to primary activities mentioned the barriers for internal trade in Mexico that prevent them to sell their goods to other states within the country. Other preoccupations are the extortion. It has increased not only from public officials who seek for bribery, and that is a reason why the digitalization sometimes fail, because public officials find it very difficult to charge bribes. So our companies are facing a higher extortion from authorities, but also from crime. And this is also very worrisome because they not only have to comply with regulatory official procedures, but also with criminal ones. And finally, what we seek is to increase again the quality of our public officials so that this can be defeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Peru, please, José Antonio.
Thank you very much. So I have to be really, really quick and short. So I'm going to read and you're going to listen, you know? It's going to be really easy. Some spiritual ancient guides used to say that if you can't be good at the little things, then you cannot be good at the big things. That's kind of a spiritual law, super wise. Where bureaucracy and bureaucratic barriers are the perfect confirmation that politicians, governments, and states are not interested in the big problems of the people because they can't solve the little problems. And they are not aware and worried about the little, not little, but important things that entrepreneurs have to deal with in their daily lives. Through this index, we discovered that Peruvian entrepreneurs spend an average of 591 hours per year dealing with state procedures. But Asociación de Contribuyentes del Perú, Peruvian Taxpayers Associations, had also discovered that a formal worker in Peru had to spend 145 days just to earn the amount equivalent to the taxes they have to pay per year. So that is 145 days working for paying taxes. Being formal then is so expensive that 76% of the Peruvian economy is informal, and I am not proud to say this, but being formal is also useless because our budget has increased in 37% in the last 5 years, and we have 10% more of poor people in Peru. So this index, and I have to finish, but I'm really, this is what I was going to say. This index is a great opportunity to advocate for entrepreneurs, for raise our voices, for poor people, and to promote states and politicians that put in the center of their decisions our families, our work, our entrepreneurships, and our worries. That should be the main center of also the money we pay as a taxes. Thank you very much.
And now we are, let me invite Center of Estudios para el Desarrollo, Uruguay.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Atlas for the invitation to Centro de Estudios para el Desarrollo. It's the first time that Uruguay participates in this index, and we hope to continue participating in the following editions. I also want to thank especially Martín Blanco, Ramiro Correa, Agustín Iturralde, and the rest of the team who made possible this work. I'm lucky to represent Centro de Estudios para el Desarrollo in this event, but I want to recognize the work of all of them. Regarding the main results for Uruguay, on the one hand, the small and medium-sized Uruguayan companies dedicated 406 hours per year to bureaucratic procedures. This result is representative because in Uruguay, 95% of companies are just small and medium-sized. Secondly, the main procedures are not homogeneous by sector. In primary sector, the main ones are specific procedures. In secondary sector, there are operational procedures, and in commerce, trade, service, there are procedures related with employee. On the other hand, at a general level, the procedures related to employment take more hours than the others, which challenge us to achieve a greater labor market flexibility. Finally, when we compare with other countries with similar per capita income like Chile or Costa Rica, Uruguay has more hours than Costa Rica, but less than Chile, and in all regions has a good position in this index. nevertheless, they have many challenges to the future. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in the Latin American Forum, Liberty Forum, who, when said, is the think tank host the next year in Punta del Este. Thank you.
There are two countries that were not able to send any representative today. They are Argentina and Venezuela. Let me just say that in the case of Argentina, they have basically the same amount of time in administrative procedure and employment procedure. It's a very important, they always say that this can be a very useful tool to help them to improve their results. In the case of Venezuela, it's very interesting to see that only 3 institutions demand 80% of the time and also 80% of the procedures. We are talking about 66 procedures, 30 of them are digitized, and funny to see that those that are digitized take more time to finish them than those that you can do them personally. Why? Because there are problems in technology, in internet, in electricity, and many other things. So, well, we have run of time, and thank you very much. I want to thank all the think tanks that I had the opportunity to leave, all of these wonderful professionals, and thank you very much, all of you, for listening to us. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And so I'm going to introduce a very special speaker who's going to charm us with his remarks. But before that, I want to take this opportunity to thank a couple of people who are here with us who were senior leadership fellows for the center. They conducted 8 wonderful classes, and I want to present them with a very small token of our appreciation, a certificate to memorialize their fellowship. And so I'll begin with one of the leading foreign policy experts, not only in the country, but I would say in the world, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. Thank you. Many of our students are here. And our keynote speaker, the 33rd President of the Republic of Colombia, President Iván Duque. Now, President Duque.
Thank you so much, Carlos Diaz. Thank you, Sari, Dr. Salinas. It's great to see such a distinguished group of leaders from think tanks from Latin America. I also want to express my salute to Leo Zwing, Ambassador Dobriansky, and especially I also want to highlight the presence of the Atlas Network today. I also want to express my gratitude to the Instituto de Ciencia Política from Colombia that is present also here in this amazing report. We've heard a lot of very interesting speeches, so I'm going to try to keep it short, but try to make some reflections about what this index is all about. I think the general reflection about bureaucracy, it's very relevant, especially if we put one element of analysis, and it's the efficiency of state. How efficient are the governments? How efficient is the government to supply the access to liberties and the provision of public goods to the majority of the citizens in a specific country? And that takes me to the reflection that was done almost 3 decades ago by David Osborne when he thought about reinvention of government. And he built a matrix. And in that matrix, he basically said that there are governments that have a high knowledge of the objectives they want to reach, but they don't know very well the means. And that is an idealistic state. So it's full of great objectives, but they don't materialize what they are mainly focused to achieve. The second are the states that have low knowledge about the objectives, but they're very good at the means, at least operationally speaking. And he said that's a bureaucratic state, because you manage the state, but you don't transform society, and you don't improve the access to liberties by citizens. The third one is the one that doesn't have any knowledge whatsoever about the objectives nor the means, and that is basically a chaotic state. And there's a state that has a great understanding of the objectives and the means, and that's the efficient, managerial, result-driven state. And I put this in the context of this report because I think what the index tells us is whether the amount of procedures and the amount of red tape, it's really limiting the liberties of those who want to exercise economic freedoms. Primarily small, medium-sized enterprises, micro-enterprises that require a great support from society and from the regulatory system to excel, or let me make it even more clearly, to survive. Now with that, I think also the report has something that I would like to put to your consideration. And it is that a highly bureaucratic system in terms of red tape and procedures also creates a very negative environment in favor of corruption. And maybe the best way to describe it is through what Robert Klitgard used to present some 2 decades ago at the World Bank, when he designed a formula that says that monopoly of information plus discretionality equals what he calls so it's a monopoly of information plus the discretionality less transparency is equal to corruption. So you have high monopoly of information by members of the bureaucratic force, and they have the discretionality of managing each procedure which without a transparent way of following up their decisions or tracking what they are doing every day. That triggers corruption. And that's why the digitalization of state and the usage of modern technologies and the reduction of unnecessary bureaucratic steps and procedures favors to have a more transparent state. But that also takes me to the report itself, and I think the report presents a very compelling case for us to reduce unnecessary procedures. But I think the report also has been taking place in the context of a post-pandemic Latin America, which is even more complex. And I think there were some elements that maybe were not brought to the table, and since this is an academic forum, I think it's great to put it before all of you so that it can enhance the report for the upcoming years. So the first one is, how do we really measure if a state is really business friendly? It's not just the red tape, it's not just the procedure, it's an overall business friendly. Because if you don't have a business friendly state, you won't be able to trigger economic growth, and you won't be able to generate employment, and by that you won't be able to improve the social safety net. There's no way to consolidate development in Latin America without a business-friendly state framework. The second element is how digital is the government in these states. Because yes, we talked about a lot of procedures, but the question is, are the states really digital? Can those procedures be eliminated? Can they be digitalized? Can they be consolidated? And how they provide the access to the citizens, so those digital services, so they don't have to spend so much hours, as has been described, going from one office to the other, but instead they can do everything online. So I think that's also a major element that I think should be considered for the next year report. The third element is how result-driven are the policies and the procedures, because that's another thing. You might have procedures, but what's interesting is that those procedures enhance the possibility of reaching results. Because if they don't reach results, what they're really doing is becoming a heavy cost on doing business. And something that is also important is how multidimensional the analysis is overall. And that takes me to the reflection about Colombia. And I just want to mention Colombia because I don't want to get, we're having a World Cup and there's still a lot of debate, so I don't want to get into an additional debate. So I'm going to mention about the way Colombia has been analyzed. And I think it's interesting because when we look at the index, Colombia seems it's half of the table. And if it's half of the list or the ranking, my first question was, how did Colombia perform in terms of economic growth vis-a-vis the best performers in the index? And what we found out is that in 2021, Colombia grew at 10.7%. It was one of the highest economic growth reached at the OECD level in the Latin American scope, but also worldwide. So we might be half of the ranking, but we were able to reach high economic growth by reducing red tape and procedures, and primarily by being able to digitalize, eliminate, or consolidate more than 4,000 procedures based on what we called Simple State Agile Colombia, a state policy that has been kept. The second element is, if we look at how we managed the pandemic and how we came out of the post-pandemic first year, we can clearly say that in a country like Colombia, in the last 4 years, including the last 2 years of the most severe economic shock we have seen in recent decades, we were able to generate 1 million new companies, micro, small, and medium size. So that means the procedures were agile enough to contain some of the negative effects of the pandemic. But at the same time, we were able to protect more than 4 million formal workers and jobs by the provision of half of the minimum wage as a subsidy during 2 years where the companies were put on stress. And that was also a very important element to help Colombia come out of the crisis with such a good economic performance. I should mention as well that when we look at Colombia and we see that the informality levels have been dropping and that the unemployment numbers have been improving, and as today we saw for the first time that we came back to 1 digit based on all these economic performance policies and the Colombian equivalent of the New Deal, which was called Compromiso for Colombia, it also allowed the country to reestablish a lot of its most important economic engine, which is the capacity to generate formal jobs. And maybe the best indicator to put it in the context is that we reached for the first time more than 10 million workers that are contributing day by day, month by month, year by year to the social safety net or the Colombian pension and job protection system, which is also a very interesting indicator. And I have to say as well that the main challenge that we have now is that looking at red tape and bureaucracy, and I come back to the rest of the context of Latin America, what I think is also interesting is how ideologized are those procedures in the countries. Because what I can certainly see as a pattern that is taking place in the region is that there is a heavily and worrying ideologization of the state against business development. There is a rising speech of anti-enterprise and trying to polarize countries between rich and poor and basically presenting the companies as the enemies of the working class. That is a grave mistake, and that can take us back to the erratic policies of the 1980s. So when you look at the best performers in this index, I think they're good performers that, in my opinion, they have been consistent over time in business-friendly policies. And I have also seen, and I praise that Brazil is doing very good in the index. I don't know if it'll be the same at the World Cup, but it's doing well in the index. I'm just kidding. So you see Brazil very good at the index, and I just have one curiosity, and it is how can we evaluate that pass from being one of the most bureaucratic states in the last time the World Bank Business Environment Index or Business Friendly Index was published in 2020, what drove it to the number one in this index in a period of 2 years and in a post-pandemic world or environment. I think it'll be great because it gives a reference model to other countries, but I also believe that there's something missing, and not in the case of Brazil, but in the whole report. And it is the diversified level of economic development around the countries. Brazil is a very big country. It's almost as big as the United States without Alaska. Then you see the other 4 to 5 countries, which are smaller countries with less than 20 million people. And then you have Colombia in the middle of the ranking, which is a country that has more than 1 million square kilometers on land territory and a very dispersed population, which makes harder the state to be more efficient in the farther territories in our country. So I think looking at that component, at the regional component, is something that has to be brought to the report of 2023. I put this as a major reflection because there's not one Colombia. You might have less procedures in Bogota or Medellin, but then you go to Caquetá, you go to other zones, and you'll find that. And the same thing will happen in Brazil. It's not the same Sao Paulo or Rio, and then compared to Goiânia, for example, or to Manaus. So I think those regional elements have to be put on the index. And last but not least, what I value the most about this exercise is that we were able to bring together with the Adam Smith Center, and I want to congratulate you, Carlos, because the center was able to convene this Atlas network, and you had think tanks from different countries working with common elements of analysis. And I think that's something that has to be praised. I consider that having this network invites us to expand it day by day and try to define at the most each of the weed elements of having a more robust index for the years to come. But my maybe last reflection today is that when we look at how difficult it has been for the countries to face the pandemic, we have to evaluate, for example, through this index, what was the correlation between the best performers in the pandemic resilience indicator, for example, published by Bloomberg. Colombia ranked number 1 in Latin America and the Caribbean, second in the hemisphere after Canada. And you see, for example, Brazil that was lagging with respect to other countries. And then you see countries like Mexico that was also lagging. But then you see countries like Ecuador or Costa Rica that were very good performers. And I think this index should be analyzed in that kind of scope. It comes out in 2022, but it comes out in the year after the first post-pandemic recovery year. And I think having that element there has to allow us to mix or combine elements of comparison with other world index. Finally, I'll say, Carlos, that as a former president, I feel very happy that these discussions are taking place with an academic view. But the most important element for the development of Latin America in the years to come is that the highly ideologization that we have seen in more countries are going to look at the state as a father state that wants to control everything, and that is a grave mistake. And you'll have the pressure of using public employment and having more bureaucratic steps as a way to control and as a way to limit economic liberties. I think today in Latin America, we can see which are the countries that are the best performers in terms of economic growth and closing their social safety net. And they are the countries that are more business friendly and that have a consistent policy of eliminating red tape and reducing bureaucracy. So with that said, I think this is going to be a report that is going to open a very important discussion in our countries, with the media, with the universities, with the political system, with parliament. And I just want to invite you to keep on doing this amazing work. And as now an academic, I have to say that I'm going to start crossing this index with many other indexes. That is one of my favorite sports, just to see what elements this report also tells us beyond the evident. Sari, I have to say, it's an amazing work. I love the devotion that you have put to this, and the fact that you're doing this brave work coming from Venezuela, that has been a state that has been basically destroyed in its economic liberties because of the highly statization of the economy, just proves that there's still bravery, good ideas that can inspire the transition to democracy. Thank you very much.
And now you see why millions and millions of Colombians elected him as president of Colombia in 2018. Thank you, Mr. President. And also thank you for highlighting the contributions of the report, but also the areas where it needs to improve and giving us some new possibilities for the next version of the report. This concludes the formal launch of this report and the activities for the fall semester for the Adam Smith Center. Thank you again to Atlas Network, and have a wonderful holiday season. Thanks, everyone.